Hey everyone, Chris here. Recently, Jeremy Crawford announced that the game design team are working on all three core books right now, and they're continuing to work on everything that we saw in the playtest documents, as well as the stuff we didn't see in the playtest. He said they're going to, he described it as, a coat of polish on the whole book to make sure it's the best book it can be. So, two predictions I'm going to make before I get too far into the main topic of this video are: number one, I see time and time again people are speculating that the final playtest will go to print mostly as is. And I'm telling you right now, that ain't gonna happen. They won't be sending out more playtest documents, but they are definitely not printing most of the stuff as it was in the last playtest. If someone wants to make that bet, I'll take that bet. Sure, there's going to be some things that stay the same, but I think most of it is going to be tweaked at minimum before printing, and some stuff might get changed a lot. Remember, they said they were fine moving forward with satisfaction scores of 70% or higher, but they looked at satisfaction scores in that range as still needing work. And number two, I also see a lot of people speculating that the Player's Handbook will be mostly like the 2014 Player's Handbook, except it's going to have more art and the stuff that was in the playtest. And the rest of it will mostly stay the same, with maybe some different wording here and there. If that was the case, they'd already be done. Jeremy Crawford said they will still be working on the Player's Handbook in May. May! I'm predicting right now a very different Player's Handbook, which brings me to the main topic of this video. I've gone over everything in the playtest documents. I've given my opinions and my predictions, and I am not going to do that again now. Instead, I'm going to go over the stuff that wasn't in the playtest, that's in the Player's Handbook, that I think needs a coat of polish, to use Jeremy Crawford's words. And when the new Player's Handbook is released, I will be checking these things first. And I think it'd be fun to do a follow-up video at that time as kind of a report card to see how many of these things were addressed. I'm not saying these will be the only things that change, and I'm not saying that these are all going to change, but these are the ones I'm keeping an eye out for. And I'm just going to start at the beginning and work to the end. And I'm likely going to do the same for the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual, but not in this video. Today, I'm just looking at the Player's Handbook, starting on Chapter 1, Step-by-Step Characters. So, most of this chapter I think is pretty good, but it's really focused on making first level characters, and it mentions that, maybe your DM will have you make a higher level character, but gives you no guidance on how your 10th level fighter might not be wearing chainmail anymore. I am expecting a more detailed section on making higher level characters, including how those higher level characters might be equipped. Now, chapter 2 through 4 were pretty much universally covered in the playtest, but let's look at chapter 5, equipment. So, shields. So if you're a lizard folk, can you benefit from a shield if you're relying on your natural armor? Yes, you can, because it says so right here. But if you're an auto-gnome, does your armored casing allow you to benefit from a shield? Well, it doesn't say. And then we have mage armor, which doesn't say if you benefit from wearing a shield, but we have sage advice on that says you can, because wielding a shield isn't the same as wearing armor. But if it doesn't count as wearing armor, then here, with the entry on armor proficiency, the penalty applies if you wear armor that you lack proficiency. But if wielding a shield isn't wearing armor, then what? I assume it's supposed to be the same penalty, but it doesn't say that. Like, it talks up here about strapping on a shield, so it would be the safe assumption that it was intended to apply to shields as well, but wielding a shield should count as wearing armor for these kinds of things, or it shouldn't. That needs to be clarified. And I gotta think, it is gonna be written down whether wielding a shield counts as wearing armor or not. And speaking of shields, it doesn't make sense that they take an action to equip or unequip when you can equip or unequip weapons so easily. So I'm going to add a prediction that equipping and unequipping shields is going to be made easier. Improvised weapons. So how do these rules interact with equipment like acid flasks and holy water or alchemist fire that say that they're improvised weapons? Do you do the 1d4 damage and then the damage listed in the item? And it says here, if an improvised weapon is like a weapon, you treat it as that weapon. Well, does it still count as an improvised weapon then? Speaking of which, why are acid and other thrown vials improvised weapons in the first place, when the explicit purpose of it is to use it as a weapon? I am expecting clear wording that leaves no question how these things work. Adventuring gear. I expect to see some of the mechanics here cleaned up, clarified, and standardized. Items like caltrops, component pouches, bullseye lanterns, and hunting traps, I think will have different mechanics. Healer's kit. Okay, so the rules for this are clean and they're clear, but it invalidates the only codified use of the medicine skill. So either the medicine skill gets more codified uses, or a healer's kit enhances the medicine skill in some way, and that would just be better for the game. You would think a character that is good at medicine would be more likely to have a healer's kit, not less likely. Tools. So we were teased basically in the playtest that skills and tools could be used together to get advantage on an ability check using both of them. What we didn't get was information on how exactly that works. Which kind of tasks involve both the tool and a skill, and if so, which skill? Assuming they keep the advantage when you have proficiency in both, I would expect them to give more guidance. Saddles. Okay, so these give you advantage on any check you make to remain mounted. That is unfortunate, since the only rule for becoming dismounted is a DC 10 dexterity saving throw and isn't a check at all. Presumably, when they were writing the rules for saddles, it was going to be a check, and then they must have changed it to a saving throw, and this fell through the cracks. So, time to fix it. And speaking of being mounted, I'll get to mounted combat later. So a warhorse costs twice as much as an elephant. Is it because the warhorse is trained for combat, and the elephant is assumed not to be trained? Doesn't say that. I have no idea. I can't see this staying as is without some significant clarification. This whole section on trinkets, it takes up a significant amount of space, and they don't do anything. More pages for rules we use, less pages for rules we don't. I cannot see them reprinting this. On to Chapter 6 and customization options. So, multi-classing. The rules on multi-classing are better than previous editions, I'll give them that, but they are still flawed enough that, from my understanding, a lot of DMs don't allow it at all. And not because they don't understand how it works, or not that it's too complicated for their players, but because it creates significant unbalance. I wish I had the answers on how to fix it. I am sure they're thinking about it. Feats. Okay, so feats were in the playtest, but I want to talk about formatting. So we know there will be feats you can take at first level, and others you need to wait until 4th level before you can take them. And please, 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 don't make the whole list alphabetical this time. What we need is a list of all the feats you can take at level 1, and then all the feats you need to be 4th level to take. Passive checks and opposed checks. I am predicting one or both of these rules will simply be gone from the new core books. And for the record, ability checks should be something you roll when you're trying to do something, and saving throws should be something you roll when you're trying to prevent something happening to you against your will. My guess is that's something that's going to be more consistent throughout the rules. And this will make it a lot easier for DMs and players to know if something is going to be a check or a save. On to Chapter 8 in Adventuring. So the rules for travel pace do an inadequate job of explaining how mounts affect your pace. This should be expanded, or changed. I mean, as they are, the travel pace of a character with a racing horse isn't higher than someone on an elephant. And if you're in a carriage being pulled by 8 galloping horses, your travel pace is the same as someone on foot. These rules just really need a rework. Difficult terrain. Okay, so difficult terrain comes up as a rule twice in the player's handbook. This one is in Chapter 8 on adventuring relating to travel pace, and then it's listed again in the combat section relating to movement in combat. And the rules are almost the same, but not quite. Like here it says moving 1 foot in difficult terrain costs 2 feet of speed. But the other entry says it costs 1 extra foot of movement, which is kind of the same, but not quite, and there's no reason for it. Also, the other rule specifies that difficult terrain doesn't stack with itself, and here it doesn't say that. I would assume we're going to have one rule for difficult terrain, and it won't matter if you're in combat or not. But speaking of combat, Chapter 9, Combat. So, surprise. The rules on hiding, which are covered in the playtest, so I've given my thoughts about those already, and the rules for surprise, which they haven't, need redesign. I am predicting surprise will be less impactful in the new player's handbook, like it will give advantage on initiative or something, but you can bet I'll be looking up this rule, and I'm guessing it won't be just this again. Search. This rule says the DM calls for a wisdom perception check or an intelligence investigation check depending on the nature of your search. Then there is no guidance given for the DM which nature of search requires which check. So they're either going to give that guidance, or maybe they'll just make search one skill, or maybe they'll just make searching use one skill or the other, or maybe they'll let the player choose which to use. But I don't think it will be this. Use an object. So we need clear differentiation between using an object with this action or the new magic action. Because currently, you actually need to look in the Dungeon Master's Guide to know that when this says, when an object requires your action for its use, you take the use an object action, doesn't apply to things like wands. Now, we know wands are going to use the magic action, but they are an object, and they require your action to use. So, clarify here what objects we're talking about. The wording here suggests you can do something with this action that elsewhere it says you can't, which is unnecessary, and I expect it will be cleared up. Melee attacks. So one of the most infamous terminology quagmires in the game is that technically a melee weapon attack and an attack with a melee weapon do not mean the same thing in D&D. The first one means that you're making a melee attack that isn't a spell attack. The second one means you're making an attack with a weapon listed as a melee weapon. So if you throw a dagger, you're making an attack with a melee weapon, but you aren't making a melee weapon attack. And they must know this needs fixing. And I was wondering how they're going to fix it, and I came to the conclusion that I'm not even sure why we need to differentiate between a melee weapon attack and a melee spell attack. Does that serve some mechanical purpose I'm unaware of? Because they use the same rules. As far as I can tell, we could just have melee attacks and ranged attacks without specifying if they're a weapon or spell attack. Maybe I'm missing something. If I am, let me know. When I brought this up to some friends, we did notice that in the playtest, they don't reference melee weapon attacks at all now. It's always melee attacks with a weapon. So that's my guess on how they're going to fix it. They're going to stop differentiating between spell attacks and weapon attacks. Half cover. So if you're a wizard and you cast grease under the feet of someone with half cover, they get a +2 on their dexterity saving throw to not fall prone. I'm curious if they're going to change this rule that sometimes makes sense and sometimes doesn't. And total cover. A target with total cover can't be targeted directly by an attack or a spell, though some spells can reach such a target by including it in an area of effect. A target has total cover if it's completely concealed by an obstacle. This last sentence doesn't work. If I'm behind a wall of force, you can see me, but there's definitely an obstacle that doesn't give you a clear path to your target. This rule sounds simple, but it has some weird consequences, and I just don't think it's going to be the same in the new player's handbook. Temporary hit points. So what I'm going to be looking for isn't this rule specifically as much as seeing if there's anything that temporarily increases your maximum hit points anymore, or if it's all been changed to give you temporary hit points instead. We already saw it with the aid spell, but I am assuming that if you're going to be increasing hit points temporarily, it's going to be temporary hit points, regardless of the source. It just makes more sense, and it's an extra thing to track. I have so many temporary hit points, and I have so many hit points temporarily increasing my maximum. It's just not needed. Alright, big one, mounted combat. So the problems with the rules for mounted combat would require an entire video or maybe an entire video series. This is something I expect to change, and I will be looking up the new rules for mounted combat as one of the first things I check when I look at my new player's handbook. All I'm hoping for are clear rules that make more sense and maybe actually use the animal handling skill somehow. These rules are unnecessarily awkward, and they really don't work well. On to Chapter 10 and spellcasting. So casting time. The very first thing I am going to check when I get my new player's handbook is whether this rule still exists. I made a video about this already, but I predict this rule is not going to appear in the player's handbook. And I'll link the video where I go over why I think this rule is disappearing. And then components. Oh, material components. Like that spellcasting focus that maybe you can complete somatic components of spells while holding, or maybe you can't, depending on whether the spell has a material component, and maybe you can cast through it, or maybe you can't, depending on the spell. All this needs cleaned up, and frankly, just simplify it. And since I'm already going to be in the spellcasting section when I first started reading the player's handbook, this is likely the second rule I'm going to be looking for changes. Targets. Okay, so we know we need a clear path to the target in order to cast a spell. But whether we need to see a target needs to be spelled out in the spell description. I'll be interested to see if they're going to simplify that. Like they could add an E component for eyesight or something like that. I saw that suggested by someone on Reddit, and it occurred to me it would make looking up whether you need to see a target or not a lot easier than having to read through the spell description. Or maybe they'll come up with something else. Or maybe it will be the same, but I'm guessing that they might simplify it. Combining magical effects. So I'm curious if this one is going to be simplified where you simply can't have the same magical effect twice, like maybe one effect replaces the other, because with this rule, you can layer effects, and if one goes away, the next one applies. So a well-known example is you could have the Death Ward spell cast on you, say 10 times, and when the first one goes down, now the next one's in effect, and so on. I am expecting some kind of refinement here. Class spell lists. So these appear at the beginning of the spellcasting section in the current player's handbook. So it is the one piece of information that you absolutely need to build a character that isn't in the section of the book where all the other character options are. I'm guessing these will be moved to the classes chapter somewhere. Maybe all together, or maybe listed with the class they belong to. Now, when it comes to the spells themselves, I'm not going to go through them one at a time. Obviously, I've always enjoyed reading spells and analyzing them, and honestly, although we only saw a handful of spell redesign in the playtest, I'm expecting most spells to be somewhat different than they are in the 2014 Player's Handbook. Wording clarifications, wording simplifications, rebalancing, standardization. Like, why have spells where you take damage if you start your turn in the area, and then others where you take it when you enter the area, and others when you end your turn in the area, and if they all work the same, like here's a dangerous area you create with a spell, and saving throws are made at the same time as other spells where you create dangerous areas, and then you don't have to look it up every single time. Here's another example. We have some spells that create difficult terrain, and we have other spells that create terrain that's difficult to move through, but it's not difficult terrain. And of course, if it's not officially difficult terrain, then it combines with difficult terrain, and it's all more confusing than it needs to be. If a spell creates terrain that's difficult to move through, then it should create difficult terrain. And if you need different types of terrain that are even more difficult, build that into the difficult terrain rules. Spells that do things to you unless you roll well should be calling for saving throws. Not you look at it and, hey, surprise, this time it's an ability check. Doesn't make sense. Ability checks are supposed to be for things you do, not things you're resisting. I think they're going to fix that. And there are a lot of spells that take you out of a fight, and there's not even another save to free yourself. I think you might get a saving throw at the end of your turn for a lot of spells that you currently don't. And finally, I am predicting a lot of spells will be different, not just a handful. I mean, there's a possibility every spell will be different in like formatting or something, but I'm talking about actual mechanical changes for a lot of spells we never saw in the playtests. And we're on to appendices. Okay, so Appendix A, conditions. Exhaustion is the most complicated condition in the book. It's something almost everyone needs to look up when it happens, at least if we're talking more than one level. I know in the playtest they proposed a simplification and then they removed it, but that doesn't mean they're going to print this as is. Appendix D, creature statistics. So I think the new player's handbook is still going to have this section, but it's going to be more concentrated on potential wild shape forms for druids, including higher challenge rating wild shape forms for moon druids. So I am definitely going to be interested to flip through this section. Appendix E, inspirational reading. So this appendix doesn't need to be here. If you're reading the appendices of the Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook, you're already familiar with modern fantasy fiction, whether it's in book form or movie form, television, or you're just aware of it through modern pop culture. You don't need a homework list to figure it out. And index. So this has probably been addressed in modern printings of the Player's Handbook, or at least I hope it has, but in my printing of the Player's Handbook, the index is terrible. Like if I want to look up Radiance of Dawn, there's going to be an entry that says, instead, look up Channel Divinity and find it under Options. I mean, just give me the page number. So let me know, is there anything else in the Player's Handbook that wasn't in the playtest that you think is going to change? And if so, how? Let's discuss it in the comments. Otherwise, until next time, I am going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.